1984. Chapter 1. It was a bright old day in April, and the clock was striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin narrowed into his breast into an effort to escape the wide wind.
Vile.
To escape the wild wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victoria Mason, though not quickly enough to prevent a spill of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelled of board cabbage and old resin mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been taken to the had been tackled to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use in trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was cutting off during the daylight hours. It was part of the economic driving in presentation for Heat Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had the various Euclid
Ulcer.
ulcer and had the
Varicose.
varicose and had a varicose ulcer
Varicose ulcer.
and had the varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shift, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of these pictures which are so controverted,
Contrived.
contrived, which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you. The captain beneath it ran.
Beneath.
The captain beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice.
Fruity.
Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong,
Oblong.
oblong. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque,
Plaque.
an oblong metal plaque, like a dialed mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sang some word, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen, it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window. A smallest, frail,
Frail.
frail figure, the meagerness,
Meagerness.
the meagerness of his body, merely emphasized by the blue overall, by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair. His face naturally
Sanguine.
sanguine. His face naturally sanguine. His skin roughened.
Roughened.
roughened. his skin roughened by saws. By
Coarse soap and blunt razor blades.
coarse soap and blunt razor blades. Coarse soap, and his skin roughened, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades, and the cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little Eddies, down in the street, little eddies of wind was
Whirling.
whirling, were rolling dust, whirling were dusting, were whirling. Whirling. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and tore paper into spirals, and tore paper into spirals, and total paper
Spirals.
and torn paper into spirals, and tore paper into spirals. And though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything, except the posters that were
Plastered.
except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The Black Mouse stomach's face.
Black Moustachio.
Black Mouse Steer's face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one of the our front immediately opposite. There was one on the house front immediately opposite. Big Brother is watching you, the captain said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at the steel level, another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, ultimately covering and uncovering the simple word INGSOC. In the far distance, a helicopter. Skimmed down. A helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered from an instant like a blue bottom, and dared away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol. It was the police patrol swinging into people's windows. The patrol did not matter, however, only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still bubbling away about pig iron and the over-fulfillment of the nice 3-year plan. The telescreen received and transformed
Simultaneously.
The telescreen received and transformed simultaneously. And transformed simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made, anything Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it, moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the mental plague. plague. Moreover, so long as he remained with the field of vision which the mental plague, which the mental plague commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often, or on what system, the thought policy plugged in on any individual where was the guesswork. It was even convenient that they watched everybody all the time, but at any rate, but at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. You had to live. Did live.
Live.
Live. You had to live. Did live. From habit that became instinct in the assumption that every sound you made was overhead, and except in darkness, every moment
Scrutinized.
scrutinized, every moment scrutinized, every moment scrutinized,
Scrutinized.
every moment scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the telegram. Winston kept his back turned to the daily screen. It was safer, though, as he well knew. Even a back can be revealing. As he will know, even a back can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Minister of Truth, his place of work, toward vast and wide about the grimy landscape. This he thought with a sort of vague. He thought with a sort of vague disaster. He thought with a sort of vigor disaster. He thought with a sort of vague. This he thought with a sort of vigor disaster. This he thought with a sort of vigor disaster. This was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the province of Oceania. He tried to square out some childhood memory that should be tell him whether London had always been quite like this. Were there always these visitors or rotting? Were there always these visitors or rotting? 19th. Were there always these vistas or rotting 19th century hours? Their sides shot up with bogs or timber.
Their sides shored up with baulks of timber.
Their sides shot up with bags of timber. Their sides shot up with bags of timber. Their window patched with cardboard, and their roofs with corrugated, and their roofs with corrugated iron. Their crazy garden walls sagged in all directions.
Sagging.
Their crazy garden wall sagging in all directions, and the bombed city, and the bombed sites, where the blast dust sphered in the air, and the willow herb stacked over the herbs of Rover.
And the bombed sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air and the willow herb straggled over the heaps of rubble.
And the bombed sites, where the plaster dust sphered in the air, and the willow herb straggled over the heaps of rubble. And the place where the bombs had cleared a large patch, and there had sprung up solid colonies of wood, dribbling like a chicken house. But it was no use. He couldn't remember. Nothing remembered. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright lit tablets occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible,
Unintelligible.
and mostly unintelligible. The Minister of Truth, miniature in Newspeak, was slightly different from any other object inside. It was an enormous
Pyramidal.
pyramidal. It was an enormous pyramidal structure. It was an enormous pyramidal.
Pyramidal.
Pyramidal. It was an enormous pyramidal structure. It was an enormous pyramidal. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up.
Soaring up.
Soaring up.
Terrace after terrace.
Terrace after terrace, terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked up on its white face in elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength.
Ignorance is strength.
Ignorance is strength. Ignorance is strength. The Minister of Truth contended. It was said. 3,000 rooms about ground level, and corresponding ramification
Ramifications.
ramifications and the corresponding ramifications below. And the corresponding ramifications below. And the corresponding ramifications below. Scared about London.
Scattered.
Scattered about London, there were just three other buildings of similar appearance and size. So completely did they draw the surrounding architecture that formed the roof of Victory Mansion.
Victory mansions.
Victory Mansions.
Scattered.
Scattered about London, there were just three other buildings of similar appearance and size. So completely did they draw the surrounding architectures and so completely did they draw the surrounding architecture that from the roof of Victoria Mansion. You could see all four of them simultaneously.
Simultaneously.
You could see all four of them simultaneously. They were the homes of the four ministers. Between which the entire apparatus
Apparatus.
apparatus, the entire apparatus of government was divided. They were the homes of the four ministers, between which the entire apparatus apparatus
Apparatus.
apparatus. They were the homes of the four ministers, between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Minister of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and fine arts. The Minister of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Minister of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Minister of Plenty, which was responsible for economical affairs. Their names in newspaper: miniature, minipax,
Minipax.
mini-law,
Minilove.
mini-law, and mini-plenty. The Minister of Peace, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and fine arts. The Minister of Peace, mini-pax. Minister of Plenty, mini-plenty. Mini-love, which was responsible for economic affairs, which maintained law and order. The Minister of Love, which maintained law and order. Mini-love. The Minister of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. The Minister of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Minister of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to enter except on official business, and then only by penetrating, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed, and then only by
Penetrating.
and then only by penetrating through a maze or buzzed wire entanglement entanglements or barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hiding machine gun nests. Gun nests. Even the street leading up to its outer barrier were roamed by guerrilla. Were roamed by guerrilla-faced guards in black uniforms, armed with joint
truncheons.
And with joint truncheons. Winston turned round
Abruptly.
Winston turned round abruptly. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism. Quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the minister at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the minister at this time of day, he had sacrificed the lunch in the canteen.
Canteen.
Canteen. He had set his features into the expression of quiet optimism, which it was advisable to wear when facing the telescreen. He crossed the room into the tiny kitchen. By leaving the minister at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast.
Food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast.
He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquid with a plain white label marked Victoria Game. It gave off a sickly By leaving the minister at this time of day, he had sacrificed his lunch in the canteen, and he was aware that there was no food in the kitchen except a hunk of dark-colored bread, which had got to be saved for tomorrow's breakfast. He took down from the shelf a bottle of colorless liquid with a plain white label marked Victoria Green, Gin, G-I-N. It gave off a sickly, oily smell. It gave off a silly oil smell, as of Chinese rice bread.
Rice spirit.
Give off a silly, oily smell, as of Chinese rice bread. Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, nerved himself for a shock, and gulped it down like a dose of medicine.
Gulped.
And gulped it down like a dose of medicine.
Medicine. Teacupful.
Winston poured out nearly a teacupful, nerved himself for a shock, and gulped it down like a dose of medicine. Instantly, his face turned scared, and the water ran out of his eye. The
Stuff. Nitric. Acid.
The stuff was like nitric acid. And moreover, it
Swallowing.
in swallowing it, one had the Sensation.
Sensation.
Sensation. In swallowing it, one had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club.
The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it one had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club.
The stuff was like a nitric acid. Nitric acid.
Acid.
Acid. The stuff was like nitric acid, and moreover, in swallowing it, one had the sensation of being hit on the back of the head with a rubber club. The next moment, however, the burning in his belly died.
Belly.
In the next moment, however, the burning in his belly died down and the world began to look more cheerful.
Cheerful.
The burning in his belly died down and the world began to look more cheerfully.
The burning in his belly died down and the world began to look more cheerful.
The next moment, the burning in his belly died down and the world began to look more cheerfully. He took a cigarette from a crumpled. He took a cigarette from a crumpled packet marked Victoria cigarettes and incautiously held it upright. Whereupon the tobacco fell out onto the floor. With the next, he was more successful. He went back to the living room and sat down at a small table that stood to the left of the telescreen. From the table drawer, he took out the pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a sink. Quarto. And a sink quarto-sized blank book with a red back and a marbled cover.
Marbled.
From the table drawer.
From the table drawer,
he took out the pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a sink, quarto-sized blank book, with a red back and a marbled cover. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed, as was the normal in the end wall, where it could command the whole room. It was in the longer wall, opposite the window. To one side of it, there was a shallow alcove. It was to one side of it, there was a shallow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flat were building, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen. So far as sight went, he could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room and had suggested to him the thing that he was now about to do. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual place. Instead of being placed, as was normal in the end wall, where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall. Opposite the window. To one side of it, there was the shadow alcove in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to build bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove,
Alcove.
And had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. By sitting in the alcove and keeping view back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen, so far as sight went. He could be had, of course, but so long as he stayed in his present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room that had suggested to him the thing that he was now able to do. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. He had just taken out of the
Drawer.
He had just taken out of the drawer. It was the
Peculiarly.
peculiarly. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth cream paper. Its smooth
Creamy.
creamy. Its smooth creamy paper. A little yellowed by age, was a kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. He could guess, however, that the book was so much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a
Frowsy.
He had seen it lying in the window of a frosty little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town.
He had seen it lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town.
He had seen it lying in the window of a frosty little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town. He had seen it lying in the window of a frosty little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town. Just what quarter he did not remember. And had been
Stricken.
And had been stricken immediately by an
Overwhelming.
desire to oppose it.
And had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it.
Overwhelming desire to place it. Overwhelming desire to praise it.
And had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it.
Overwhelming, and had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops dealing on the free market, it was called. But the rulers was not strictly kept, because there was various things such as shore legs and razor blades, which it was impossible to get hold of in any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street, and then had slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not conscious.
Conscious.
Conscious. At the time, he was not conscious of eating it for any particular purpose. He had carried it guiltily.
Guiltily.
Guiltily. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase, even with nothing writing in it. It was a compulsive processing.
It was a compromising possession.
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 It was a compromising possession. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was of a kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. He could guess, however, that the book was much more than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a fossil little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town. Just that quarter he did not allow. Just what quarter he did not now remember, and had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops dealing on the free market. It was called, but the ruler was not strictly kept, because there was various things such as shore legs, and razor blades, which it was impossible to get hold of in any other way. He had given a quick glance up and down the street, and then had slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the time, he was not consciously wanting it for any particular purpose. At the time, he was not consciously wanting it for any particular purpose. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase. Even with nothing writing in it. It was a compromising possession. It was a compromising. It was a compromising possession. The thing that he was about to do was to open a dairy. This was no illegal.
Illegal.
This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal, since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it could be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked it to get the greatest grease out of. Winston fit a nib.
Nib.
Nib into the pen holder. Winston fit a nib into the pen holder and sucked it to get the gas off.
Grease.
Grease and sucked it to get the grease off, and sucked it to grease and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an
Archaic.
The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used even for signatures, and he had produced one furtively and with some difficulty, simply because of a feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with the real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Simply because of feeling that the beautiful cream paper deserved to be writing on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was unusual to dictate everything into the speechwriter, which was of course impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink and then flattened for just a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was the decision act. In small
Clumsy.
In small clumsy letter he wrote, April 4th, 1944.
April 4th, 1984. April 4th, 1984.
The thing that he was able to do was to open a diary.
Diary.
The thing that he was able to do was to open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal, since there was no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonable certain that it would be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an ethnic instrument.
Archaic.
The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used even for signature, and he had produced one, and he had procured one.
To procure.
And he had procured one. and he had procured one furtively and with some difficulty. Furtively and with some difficulty. Simple, because of a feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with the real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand, apart from very short notes. It was unusual to dictate everything into the speaking writing, which was of course impossible for his present purpose. He dipped the pen into the ink and then flatted for just a second. A tremor had gone through his body. To make the paper was the decision act. In small clumsy letter he wrote. He dipped the pen in the ink and then flatted for just a second. A tremor had gone through his balls.
Vowels.
A tremor had gone through his balls. To make the paper was the decision act. In small clumsy letter he wrote. In small clumsy
letters he wrote.
April 4th, 1944. April 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that this was 1984. It must be wrong about that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945, but it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two.
But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two.
But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. But it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. For whom it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future, for the unborn. His mind hovered for a moment round the doubtful date on the page, and then fitched up with a bump against the newspeak. Word double-think. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him.
For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him.
Magnitude.
For the first time, the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could you communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future could resemble the present, in which case it could not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless.
Predicament.
Predicament.
And his predicament would be meaningless.
And his predicament would be meaningless. Either the future could resemble the present. Either the future would resemble the present. Either the future could resemble the present, in which case it would not listen to him. In which case it would not listen to him, or it would be different from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. And his predicament would be meaningless. For some time, he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music.
Strident.
Strident. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say. But even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say. For weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment, and it had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. And he had to do was to transfer to paper the interminable restless monologue. All he had to do was to transfer to paper the interminable restless monologue that had been running inside his head, literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Even the monologue had dried up. However, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose
ulcer.
Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itch unbearably. He dared not scratch it, because if he did so, it always became inflamed. Because if he did so, it always became inflamed. The seconds was ticking by.
The seconds were ticking by.
He was conscious. He was conscious of nothing except the blackness of the page in front of him, the inch of the skin about his ankle, the blaring of the music. and the sight bleeding caused by the gin.
The blaring of the music, and a slight wooziness caused by the gin.
And the slight bleediness caused by the gin.
Gin.
The blaring of the music.
The blaring of the music, and a slight wooziness caused by the gin.
The blaring of the music, the blaring of the music, and the slight bleediness caused by the gin. For some time, he sat, gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music.
Strident.
Strident. The telescreen had changed over to strident. The telescreen had changed over to strident. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say. For weeks past, he had been making ready for his moment, and it had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was to transfer to paper the interminable, restless monologue that had been running inside his head, literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. Moreover, his varicose ulcer.
Varicose ulcer.
Varicose ulcer. Moreover, his varicose ulcer had begun itching unbearably. He dared not sketch it.
He dared not scratch it.
He dared not scratch it, because if he did so, it always became inflamed. The seconds were ticking by. He was conscious of nothing except the blankness of the page in front of him, the inching of the skin above his ankle, the blocking of the music, the blaring of the music, and the slight blueness caused by the gin. Suddenly, he began writing in sheer panic, only imperfectly. Only imperfectly aware of what he was sitting down. His small but childish. His small but childish handwriting struggled up and down the page, shading first its capital letters, and finally even its full stops.
Shedding first its capital letters and finally even its full stops.
Shouting first its capital letters and finally even its full stops. Okay, let's close today's recording.